problem. Well, think about that. And she said to him, well, why don't you run for politics if that's a concern? He then made probably the only honest comment he's ever made in his life, where he said, you can't do anything as a politician. She said, well, what are you going to do? He said, I'm going to go to the United Nations, and I'm going to where I can get all the money I want and not be accountable to anybody. That's precisely what he did. And I want your audience to think about, how would you get rid of an industrialized nation? Well, what they did was they decided that the industrialized nations had gained their advantage through the use of fossil fuels. That had given America its great advantage and the developed nations their advantage. And the byproduct of fossil fuels was CO2. And so they then set about creating the science to show that CO2 was causing global warming. That was done by Strong in his structure and organization at the United Nations Environment Program that was introduced in Rio, as I said, in 1992. Now, the two sides of it were, one was the COP, the Conference of the Parties. They do the political agenda. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they provide the science that supports what the COP are doing and recommending. And so that was the way it was set up. Let me step aside from that for a minute, Patrick, because one of the things that I have learned in my career is that, and most people still think this, that government commissions of inquiry are great things. You hear it every day. Oh, there's a conflict. Oh, well, why doesn't the commission or the government appoint a separate commission of inquiry? And they're called different terms. But in the public's mind, oh, that's good. We're going to get the politics out of this issue. It'll be an independent study. The very first commission of inquiry I ever got appointed to, I discovered that, in fact, it gives the politician even greater control. And not only that, but it takes them off of the political and media hook. Because if the media come along and say, well, what are you doing about this? Oh, I've got a commission of inquiry. I can't comment until the report comes in. They're now off the hook on the issue. But what they do is they go with the bureaucrats. They write the terms of reference for the commission. They predetermine the outcome of the commission. And I can tell you from my own experience, I was appointed to a commission of inquiry on water in a lake in Manitoba, Canada. It had been a conflict for 100 years. And finally, the minister said, okay, we'll have a commission. And I was appointed to the commission. We got the terms of reference. They were so restrictive, we couldn't possibly determine a solution because we couldn't even get access to the data. And so what I did was I went and said to the chairman of the commission, Mr. Duncan, I said, you tell the minister, either I get full access to all the information, or I'm going to go to the media and tell the media you're trying to predetermine the outcome of this commission. We got then, and the minister decided that was a bigger political threat than what he was doing. We got access to all the information, discovered documents, 100-year-old documents written by an engineer in the area saying, here's the problem with the lake and here are the solutions. And there had been 3 commissions of inquiry since that time. Not one of them had acted on because the politician that had ordered the commission had moved on with his pension and retired, and the issue had got pushed aside. Let me illustrate my point for the Americans. One of the things about your old conspiracy theories, one of the biggest ones in the U.S. is the Warren Commission and who killed Kennedy. That's the great conspiracy theory. I watched Chief Justice Warren interviewed on American television, and the questioner said to him, why didn't you look at the mafia connection with Jack Ruby in Dallas? And Chief Justice Warren said very quietly and calmly, it wasn't in my terms of reference. I knew what he was saying. He was saying, I was told not to go there. But for most of the public, that comment would have gone completely over their heads. And that is why that whole thing, the Kennedy assassination, is such a conspiracy theory agenda on the internet today. Well, what Maurice Strong did when he set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was a commission of inquiry into climate change, he limited them by saying, you only look at human causes of climate change. That's the terms of reference they were given. And you can go and read that as Article 1 in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, published in 1992. And the point is, and everybody, the scientists listening to your program will know that unless you know how much the climate change is naturally, you can't possibly identify the human portion of that. But what did that term of reference allow? It allowed the IPCC, who the public think are looking at total climate change when they're not, they're only looking at human causes, it allowed them to limit what they looked at. So, for example, there are 3 greenhouse gases. That is, gases that are supposedly have the property of allowing sunlight into the Earth's atmosphere, heating the surface of the Earth, and then restricting the escape of that heat out to space. That's the greenhouse effect. The public are led to believe, because the IPCC only look at CO2, that it is the most important greenhouse gas. And of course, then what they argue from that, well, if the CO2 goes up, then the temperature will go up. But what the public are not told is CO2 is only 4% of the total greenhouse gases. The largest greenhouse gas by far is water vapor. It's 95%. But how do they get away from not looking at it? They just say, well, the amount of water vapor humans produce is so small relative to the total amount in the atmosphere that it's not important. So we'll just assume water vapor in the atmosphere is constant and ignore it. That's like saying, I'm going to look at my car, which is not running very well, but I'm going to ignore the engine, and I'm going to ignore the transmission, and I'm going to look at one nut on the right rear wheel, which is the CO2. And the focus even more narrow than that, because the nut represents all CO2, that is CO2 from natural sources. They're only looking at one thread within the nut, which is the human portion of the CO2. That's how much they've narrowed the focus by their terms of reference to the IPCC. That's how they've controlled the whole process. Now, of course, the reason that you've been hearing more about natural events, this is going on, or more storms, more hurricanes, all that's occurring is perfectly natural. But because they don't look at what's natural, and they know the public don't know what is natural, they can get away with saying that what is natural is unnatural. And that's what's been happening. They've ramped that up in the last 24 months in anticipation of the Paris conference. And so this is why you're hearing all of these things, and every day there's another new scare, and it's all part of the political manipulation and the propaganda that's going on prior to the Paris conference. Now, by the way, just to back up for a minute on this, or to add to this, in order to shut down or make the developed nations, the industrialized nations, pay for their sins of producing CO2, they brought in the Kyoto Protocol. And the Kyoto Protocol was to say, we're going to limit the amount of CO2 that you developing nations are allowed to produce. We're going to tax you on that. We're going to make you pay a fine, became cap and trade. And we're going to take that money that you've made by causing global warming, and we're going to give that to the developing nations who've suffered because of your greed and your misuse of these resources. That's what the Kyoto Protocol was about. The United States Senate voted 95-0 against, because they said, look, it's not going to change anything, and all it's going to do is cost jobs and affect the economy negatively. So that created the difficulty. Nonetheless, they were still pushing through the Kyoto Protocol. And let's elaborate on this, because one of the things we've seen recently is that Putin in Russia has said that he's not in favor of Paris and what's going on. He doesn't accept the science of the global warming. He didn't accept it before. He sent his economic advisor by the name of Andrei Illarionov around the world making a PowerPoint presentation showing all the science of how bad the science on climate and global warming was. I attended one of those presentations in Vancouver, Canada. It was a very good presentation. You can get it on the internet still. Illarionov went around the world saying Putin's not going to sign Kyoto. He doesn't believe in it. He went back to Moscow, and 3 months later, Putin announced he was signing Kyoto. Illarionov resigned. He's now working at the Cato Institute in the United States. You say, well, why did Illarionov resign, and why did Putin change his mind? Well, the problem they had with the Kyoto Protocol was twofold. One was that it was set up by saying we need we need enough countries that produce 55% of the CO2 that's going from human production. We need enough of those countries producing 55% of it to ratify the treaty to bring it into force. Because America said we're not going to sign, then there were not enough countries that produced 55% to ratify the treaty. So they went to Putin and they blackmailed him. And Putin himself said this. You can Google this. It's right out there in the media. Putin said, they said to him, either you sign Kyoto or we will not support your application to be in the World Trade Organization. Putin, being the grossly practical politician that he is, said, okay, I'll sign Kyoto. He signed Kyoto. That's why he did it. And he said, I'm only doing it because I'm being blackmailed into it. And so now we've got this problem of Putin coming along now and saying he's not going to sign because he's decided developing his trade and his economy is far more important. But there was another thing that happened. Kyoto was going to be, with Putin's support, Kyoto was going to be ratified at the COP15. Now, that was the Conference of the Parties 15 was scheduled for Copenhagen. It was scheduled for November, and what happened was that just prior to the conference in Copenhagen, somebody leaked all of the scientific information of what the scientists were doing that were controlling the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Again, your listeners can Google it. It's called ClimateGate. This was the release showing of how they were fixing the books, how they were controlling the peer review process, how they were isolating CO2 as the problem, how they had produced a hockey stick graph which completely rewrote history. And that was enough, and it was done deliberately to derail the Kyoto Protocol, and it was enough to derail it. But of course, they don't give up. What they did was at Durban the next year, in COP16, they went to Durban, and by the way, at these COPs, for example, the last one that was in Berlin, 6,000 people show up. Over 50% of them are non-government organization people. That is, their Greenpeace, Sierra Club, and so on. So 50% of the membership of the COPs are the environmental groups pushing their agenda. But anyway, what happened in Durban was they stopped calling it Kyoto, and they introduced an idea that was called the Green Climate Fund. And this was a fund that all of the nations of the world were supposed to put in their money to pay for their sins of producing CO2. And the money is deposited into a bank account in South Korea, controlled by the IMF. And of course, that's part of what's being pushed in Paris. So they derailed it briefly with the ClimateGate exposure. And what happened after the ClimateGate exposure, they immediately commissioned inquiries to investigate it. In other words, they